This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by Allison Cook, Lindsay Trebet, and Super Inframan. If you'd like to help support the show, you can do so at wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight we're doing listener stories, and I have with me Mr. Chris Ernst.
Hello, everybody.
Who I don't know if you've ever done a listener stories with us, have you?
We've done like email listener stories, but not when we've had the listener here. So this is pretty awesome.
Well, no, so we also have Saxon Williams. Hello.
Hello.
And you do have some stories, but we're doing the actual email ones with Saxon.
Great.
Who is also a top-level Patreon, one of the sponsors of the show, as Super Inframan.
It's one of those things I'm really proud to do. I love the show. I love everybody you have on here, so I'm proud to support it. And thanks for letting me sit in tonight.
Oh, absolutely. I love getting to say Super Inframan.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
So yeah,
we were just talking before the show about where that comes from, and it's it is this great. If nobody knows about this, it's super cool. I knew about it, but I hadn't made the connection. It's essentially this like Chinese Superman movie that was made in Hong Kong in the 70s. I have to see it. This is like a cult film that I've never seen that I really should, and I am super excited that Saxon reminded me of what this is because this is a pretty epic film. The Super Inframan, translated literally as Chinese Superman. Yeah.
That's it. It's a ton of fun. If you have the time to make for it, give it a watch. It's one of those movies where everything is explosive. If they bump something sideways, it probably explodes. And, of course, there's kung fu and crazy costumes and monsters. So
best kind of film.
Yeah, every best thing in life.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to be going through some listener stories if we have time. I mean, Saxon, we had read one of your stories in either one of the last couple of shows. We dealt with one of your stories or a couple of your stories that you had sent in.
Yeah.
And you said you have had other stuff happen to you as well.
Oh, yeah. And it's one of those things you forget how many things happen to you or that are interesting that occur in your life until you stop and look back at it again. One of the most interesting ones, and I mostly seem to have like paranormal things happen around me, if that makes any sense. But even in high school, when we graduated, I grew up in the South. Some parents would have like the graduates over and they'd have little cookouts and things. And I was standing there eating a hamburger. It's late in the evening and looking up at the stars by this person's pool. And there's a dot in the sky that starts moving in straight lines and turning at 90-degree turns. And I called a couple other people over, and they saw it too. And we probably watched this thing for 30 minutes. It was there long enough that people actually got bored watching around the sky. It was just a white dot. It looked like it could have been a star if you weren't paying attention to it. But just kind of stuff like that. But the fact that, I was standing there with probably, 8 other people and we're all watching it. I'm like, okay, I know I'm not imagining this. I know this isn't an airplane. Mm-hmm. It was interesting.
Yeah.
Of course, later in my life, I had a lot of experience with shadow people and things like that are always fun. But, go ahead.
No. Finish what you're saying.
Yeah, so the shadow people thing is always very interesting. Because I started having a lot of sleep paralysis, lucid dreaming. You could call that out of body. It's one of those things. It's sort of that nebulous space where might have been, might have not been. I'm not sure, but I ended up having, especially when I had a lot of anxiety. Shadow people showing up in my bedroom at night. Being in that sort of like sleep paralysis state and literally like feeling like I was wrestling with them. Yeah, it was really, really uncomfortable. And you start turning into an insomniac because you don't want to go to sleep because you know that this might happen again.
Right.
Yeah.
I eventually got to a place where I could kind of imagine, or I would become very angry and like just decide, all right, if this is a dream, if I'm lucid dreaming, then I can control it. So I just started setting them on fire, believe it or not.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it worked, and so every time I would do that, it would go away for several months, and then it would show up again, and then it's kind of the same process again. But, I think the intentionality behind it helped it out quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's always seems to be the case, I feel. I always go back to that whole Carlos Castaneda thing about looking at your hand, or at least that's where I first came across it.
Yeah, that's where I came across it too.
All shadiness about Carlos Castaneda, wherever it came across the side. Yeah, right. That like worked. So, I mean, I remember when I was in high school, when I like sort of tried that during a lucid dream, and it really worked. And it was just like, yeah, that intentionality is, I remember that consistently. I seldom as an adult now do I have as many lucid dreams, but I used to have them a lot when I was a teenager. And yeah, I constantly had to like intend things to make them happen. Like I remember even flying and stuff like that. The older I got, the more like sort of intention I needed to sort of like, I don't know, interact in that world.
Right. Absolutely. I don't know if you guys ever had the experience when you would, lucid dream and fly and then feel yourself slowly sink.
Yes.
So you have to kind of like reinforce the thought that like, no, I'm not sinking back to the ground. I'm definitely flying.
Yeah,
Yes.
Totally. Yeah, I remember I specifically, there was these recurring dream I had, I don't know, it was probably about 13, where I had to like, I had to kind of run and sort of jump to get off the ground. Almost like I had to catch air like a plane does when, you're doing in takeoff. And it got harder and harder. So the older I got, because these dreams kept on happening throughout like young teen years. And there's one thing I actually remember talking to Ren Collier about this, is this moon, this very particular moon that was in my, like the dreamscape that I would have. And it was always the same type of full moon that was in there. Remember when I was reading like Lovecraft dream stuff, it was I would always think about the sort of like the dream sky, and I felt, is when I was a teenager and having these experiences, I was like, oh well, this is totally like I'm in the real dream world now because there's this recurring moon.
Right. It's interesting that you point that out too. Like you talk about that happening a lot in your teenage years. That was definitely when I had the most like lucid dream experiences in my life consistently. Were probably like 14 through, I don't know, 19, 20, somewhere through there. And where we grew up, I grew up on a farm, and we had a pond down below us, and I could very vividly fly through the roof of my house and over the pond. And what was fascinating about it, of course, is the way you would be immaterial sometimes, but maybe not in others in parts of the dream. But you could feel the water, the dew and things like that coming up from the wake, flying over the pond and things like that.
Yeah.
But that was kind of my reference, sort of like your moon. That pond was a place that I knew that I was like close to home.
Totally. Yeah. No, it's funny how crystal clear those can be. I have, as an adult, I haven't, it's been few and far between do I have really lucid dreams like that. But I also, my sleep, I'd say, it's not as good as it was when I was a teenager.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, I want to take back to a story that was actually in the letter I sent in, but I think this is one that's fun to talk about if it's okay with you guys.
Sure.
Totally.
And since we're talking about being younger, when I was about 7, I was at a cookout, early afternoon. It was at my aunt's place. They had a lake house, and the lake sort of made like a sort of a T-shaped slough through the trees to the bank of their backyard, and the water probably started about 50 yards from their back door, maybe a little bit further, but it was up a hill, so you didn't have to worry about if the water rose or something like that, like the water was going to come into the house. But anyway, my brother and I are there, and we see this tremendous snake. It's just its head, at the top of the water, like you might see sort of like an alligator resting. And when I say big, I mean it was 8 feet by 6 feet, thereabout. Incredibly huge. And my brother saw it. You know, and it's one of those things that over the years I kind of have to like revisit with him to make sure that we saw that and that wasn't something that I dreamed or, you know, mixed up at older. But what was weird is, you know, our family members were there and they didn't really register that it was a giant snake, which I was fascinated by. And then it sort of came down the T towards the bank, you know, just the head drifting towards you. And right as it got to the edge of the bank, it submerged, which there shouldn't have been room for it to have done that just based on its size. It was just one of those things I revisit a lot because it was so strange. And the older I've gotten, the more I think it's even stranger. It had solid red eyes, and they almost looked fake. Wow. Yeah. I mean, it was a very strange thing. You know, but anyway, I never saw anything like that again. I went back after it was on the Listener Story show where you read it to like look and see if anybody had talked about any kind of like cryptid sightings or anything around some of the different lakes and stuff around here to see if I like maybe that's what it was. Because I never considered it as like a cryptid type thing. I just thought of it as something strange that happened.
Right.
And I have no idea what to make of it. You know, I've considered myself an intellectual fan of chaos magic and things like that and big ideas and what have you. And so I've just kind of decided that it was a big idea of a snake.
Yeah. Where this is in the South, you said? You grew up in the South?
Yeah, the Delta. Yeah. Or Louisiana, Arkansas area.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I guess I don't know enough about the wildlife around there. I know one thing. Like, I grew up when I was little, up until I was about 5 or 6. I was in Georgia, and we had these copperheads, but they never got nearly that big. That's huge, and the red eyes. It's interesting. Well, I mean, and it's sort of fitting into the space of the pond there. It's great.
Well, yeah. I mean, the head was a head that's 8 feet across. It's just I don't know. I love it. Yeah, bizarre stuff. But it's, I don't know. It's one of those that I'm like, okay, Brandon, you know, you saw this too, right? Yeah, I did. Okay.
All right. Well, the first story I have here is kind of long, but it's also really interesting. It's a few different experiences, and there's some really interesting stuff here. All right. So this is coming from Alec. And he says, I'm not entirely sure where to start, and he apologizes for the length of it, but that's fine. As a kid, one of my true loves was nature, and my parents raised me as a realist, i.e., if there's no scientific proof of something, then it does not exist. But I was always a very curious child. The unknown fascinated me. I was also growing up in the time of the TV show Monster Quest, which was hands down one of my favorite shows back then. And I think it was a huge influence on me. But backing up to when I was 6, I had been living in New York for a few years. This memory, while it may easily be chalked up to an overactive imagination, is seared in my mind and was as real to me as any other experience I've had. It was around 10 p.m. and I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep. I turned over on my other side and was facing the interior of my room because at the time the bed was pushed up into a corner. I opened my eyes, and there in the corner of my room was a tall, thin, dark figure about 7 foot tall. It scared me so bad that I screamed and ran into my parents' room. It's been suggested to me that it could have been astral projection, which I know very little about, but it was really the first strange occurrence I remember. I mean, it sounds like a shadow person to me.
It does to me, too. So my brother I was telling you about, we had bunk beds in the same room, and he had an experience really similar to that, where he woke up and turned around, and there was a very tall, dark figure standing there. And, closed his eyes a few times, and then it was gone. It'd be interesting to find out if this was a recurring thing or something like that.
For him, I think it was just the one time.
Okay.
Because he continues with the next thing that was very strange happened in 9th grade. My town is very hilly, and my friend and I were walking up the hill on our street. It was about 8 p.m., and at that time of year, it was already dark out. Suddenly, there was a bright flash in the sky, so we looked up to see what objectively looked like a bright meteor burning up, except it seemed so close to us, and the really strange part is that it was moving incredibly slow. I've seen many shooting stars in places with no light pollution all around the world, and this was similar, but just as if it was extremely close up and moving at an impossibly slow speed. Strange, but again, it's possibly explained away. I've never seen a slow-moving shooting star before.
No, I mean, shooting stars are usually quite fast.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it was, I mean, in terms of motion, I wonder if it was, it's always hard when you're looking at sort of, celestial bodies or anything in the sky to sort of gauge the distance. I wonder how large it was sort of did they say how large it was or it was the size of a shooting star?
No, he didn't really say. It looked like a bright meteor burning up.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Saxon.
I hate to say ball lightning, but I mean, it may have just been some type of, electrical phenomenon. That's all I could think of, but who knows?
No, that's actually a much better explanation than a shooting star.
Yeah. Especially if it was, slow moving. I mean, light phenomena and, plasma, ball lightning phenomena, UFOs, all of them being really part of the same thing, at least in how people see them. It's funny how long these have been going on in history, and we still it really to me. I think sometimes it's a little bit ridiculous. We have records of these things happening for so long, and that everybody is still, besides the sort of small contingent of people that are really thinking about it, nobody really is thinking. We just still don't know what they are.
Yeah.
Was it Ren last week that was talking about how we kind of have to re-educate ourselves about these phenomena like every so often?
Yeah, he was saying that. Was it last week? I have a few shows recorded that I haven't put up yet, so I don't know which one's which now. But he had said something about how, we learn this stuff, but we're doing it from a different perspective, and then we have to relearn the stuff from a different perspective, and we don't look and realize that it's the same thing, just from a different perspective. Yeah,
I mean, I definitely, Ren and I are pretty simpatico along those lines. I think especially in or at least our view on, the paranormal vis-a-vis the occult and, ufology. But yeah, for sure. I mean, it's and this isn't even the phenomena taking on, a different form in the sense of, saucers, more recently airships at one point, right. Chariots at one point. This is just people have been seeing lights in the sky, that are not, celestial bodies for the longest time. And, we keep on coming back. We keep on going again. It's I don't know if we're losing the knowledge that, we have and starting over from scratch. But yeah, I think that's, it's kind of ridiculous when you think about it from the forest for the trees perspective and take a macro view on it.
True.
Yeah. That was one of those things I always loved about Jeff Kripal, because he would always argue that, we need these things back in academia to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need to know or have to find out the answer to what these things are, but we need to acknowledge them so we don't forget about them and have to re-educate ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. It makes me think of that Kripal's that's a good reference. It makes me think too of and I think this is going along with Kripal, Gary Luckman's was it Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, where he's essentially talking about in particular, he's talking about this guy, Owen Barfield, who sort of came out of the Romantics. I'm probably butchering that, but this idea that you would see sort of in some of these artists and poets like Byron, where there's essentially, and this is something that was kind of lost in the new age of science, is that there is a different, the way of knowing, the imagination was considered by some of these poets and romantics as being, equally as valid as another way of knowing, and that Luckman's kind of making this argument along with using Owen Barfield's argument that we as humanity sort of lost this when we went into the material science phase of humanity over the past past 1,000 years or so, and that we've lost this way of like really connecting with imagination and with the world as being a manifestation, an outward manifestation of our imagination. And I always go back to that. At least over the past few years, when I think of these things we're talking about, this sort of like these things that play out and we figure them out, and then we have to relearn them and we don't know what they are, and this sort of like losing memory as time goes on.
Well, I don't think we ever figure them out. I think we put them in a paradigm, and then paradigm goes away and we start all over again.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Absolutely.
All right. So the next part. In our town, we had a somewhat large patch of woods down the street from me, and of course, being adventurous teenagers, that would be the place to go where we would drink in high school. I got to the point where I could navigate through the woods in near total darkness. One time, it was fairly late, and only a couple of friends and I went out there to have some fun and just hang out. We were there for maybe an hour and called it quits, so we split up, and each of us went our separate ways through the woods to our different respective neighborhoods. While walking home, I looked up into the forest towards this large glacial erratic that seemed somewhat dropped in the middle of the woods. This boulder must have been 12 to 15 feet tall, and I had played on it many times as a kid. I even found tons and tons of oyster shells around it, and presumably back from when Native Americans lived in this area. My house is less than a mile from the Hudson River, so it seemed the most likely scenario. What I saw was this very faint light moving smoothly around the woods. At first glance, I thought it was a flashlight, but after taking a harder look, it seemed to be a cylinder of light that was slowly flying through the woods. I got a very ominous feeling and started speed walking down to my street. I've never seen that again in these woods, but it's not the last strange thing I've seen, and not the last time I got an ominous feeling there. The next one is probably the hardest for me to talk about. So after high school, I was going out to college in Durango, Colorado. Unfortunately, the year before, I had had a serious mountain bike injury where I spent months unable to walk because of the amount of blood still in my stomach from internal bleeding, which sounds awful. In September, I had gotten healthy enough where felt I could attend school, but not all of my classes, because as an outdoor adventure education major, a lot of my classes were physically demanding, such as alpine mountaineering and whitewater rafting. But nonetheless, as the semester pressed on, I felt healthier and healthier to the point where I was back to riding my bike in the mountains behind campus. Early one morning, I took a ride on the local trails behind Raiders Ridge. It was still fairly dark, the sun had not risen over the ridge, and there was some ambient light, but not much. I was riding up a steep hillside in my lowest gear, which was practically walking speed. I felt a pebble hit me and thought nothing of it. Then another one hit my hand, odd, but it could just be rocks rolling down the steep ridge to my right. I stopped to have a drink of water, and when I looked up about 30-ish feet in let me try that again. I stopped to have a drink of water, and when I looked up about 30-ish feet in see, I'm having problems with this part here. 30-ish feet in from of me. Okay, I think it's just it sounds
like
the wrong word.
A typo.
30 feet in behind a large bush was an extremely large black mass. It was dark to the point where it seemed like it absorbed any light that hit it, sort of like it was that newly invented paint called Vanta Black. I felt as if this was not something I wasn't supposed to see, but at that point I was not sure what I was looking at. The air felt heavy, like when the pressure changes before a big thunderstorm. Then it stood up. It was easily 6.5 to 7 feet tall, but I could not see any real definitive features because it was such a deep black and was somewhat backlit. It was huge, but more than a basketball player kind of huge, not a football player kind of huge. Officially scared out of my goddamn mind, I felt paralyzed until I heard what can only be described as the most ungodly growl. It was like a tiger on steroids. I felt it reverberate in my chest. that snapped me out of it, and I shuffled my bike around and blitzed down the mountain as fast as I could. I heard it behind me, breaking branches as I went, but I was so focused on not crashing, I'm not sure at the point where I stopped hearing it. I got down to the entrance of the trail system on the road and collapsed. I rarely ventured over that ridge again. Unfortunately, not long after that, I had another injury where 2 of the discs in my lower back ruptured, so I was unable to continue school and moved back to New York for physical therapy. That experience paired with the other injury led me to a dark time in my life. I never told anyone what I saw until years later, and I started spiraling down the road to addiction because of the painkillers I was on. It helped me bottle up and forget what I had seen that morning, but thankfully I haven't touched painkillers in years now, and I have come to embrace all the strange things I have seen in my life. There's more, but we'll stop there for a moment because it sounds like he's describing something like what was in his bedroom.
Yeah, and this is during the daytime as well? You said in the morning?
Morning, yeah, just as it was just starting to get light.
Just starting to get light, yeah. Well, liminal time right there.
Yep.
I mean, it's, there's always the possibility that it was something like, bears when they get up on their hind legs can be pretty look comparatively skinny, not, you know what I mean? But I also totally believe if they are sure that was not a bear, then I believe that. In which case, yeah, it's terrifying. It kind of the picture I got in my head is, do you ever see that? It's a recent film called The Ritual. It's
I love that.
Yeah. It kind of. I just thought for a second of that weird creature, the forest god that has arms for antler, hand, face. Yeah, It's great.
All right, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, there's some different of the indigenous people in Alaska have stories about, it was sort of like a Bigfoot. I'm not going to do it justice by qualifying it that way, but character that they relate to beavers and things like that can sort of blend in and out of shadows. Mm-hmm. And that crossed my mind too, but I actually, that connection to what he saw when he was a kid makes so much more sense to me, because I always think these things are very personal in a lot of ways and can be tied to you and are influenced by you too.
And I think you're right, and I think it makes sense too, or it makes sense to me as crummy as it was for this person going through it, that this experience not only links back to their childhood, but then also was a catalyst or was somehow involved in a difficult time in their life. And I feel like a lot of times you'll find that's the case, either positive or negative. I think it can be. You'll find something happens that is an not unnatural, but an unexplained event. It acts as this sort of catalyst for some change in your life. So. Yeah, and that feeling, they talked about the feeling of this being something that they shouldn't see. That's something to pay attention to. Trusting your gut. There's no logical reason why you would feel that. So I think that's very interesting and something that to kind of pull out and think about when people are having experiences like this. What are you feeling about it at this point? Not just what you're seeing.
And of course, the growl that sent him down the hill too is something. Because yes, bears can roar, but they don't sound ungodly. They sound like bears.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So he says the next thing that happened just last summer, I walk dogs in my town and usually take them through the woods I had mentioned earlier. We were finishing up a walk and getting close to exiting the woods when I heard the sound of leaves rustling behind me. The dog picked up on it too and was completely fixated on it, which was unusual because he usually pays no attention to the deer or squirrels we see. I spun around to see what it was, and all I caught was this hairless, pasty gray shoulder and part of an arm, or what looked like one, poking out behind a tree. It's like it knew I turned around and retreated behind the tree fully, but not before I saw part of it. What was weird is this was not a large tree. The shoulder seemed to be about the same size I am, about 5'8", 130 pounds. Curious, I started to walk toward the tree, but the dog would not move any closer. That is when I felt an intense feeling of fear, so I turned around and quickly walked out of the woods. In the last few years, strange stick structures have popped up all over the woods. TPs, A's, and some other weird structures that seem to be built overnight. Not not there one day and there the next. I have been documenting the ones I have found and have many pictures of them. I would not rule out the possibility of local kids, but from what I have learned about Bigfoot and their habits in the last few years, sometimes I wonder. I just can't imagine they would be in such an urban area. Although a few years ago, I heard some very, very loud owls in those woods. I have heard plenty of owls when I go out camping, and these were way louder and sounded a bit off. Kind of like something was trying to mimic owls and was doing a good job, but not perfectly. So the gray thing, that's just weird. I mean, for the thing to be able to disappear entirely behind a not large tree is strange.
Yeah.
So did I understand it right with like the implication was that it was a normal sized creature, but part of it sort of vanished behind the tree and part of it was poking out?
Well, part of it was poking out at first, and then it leaned back completely behind the tree.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that is really creepy.
And he doesn't specify, but I assume when he's saying it was not a large tree, it would not be saying a normal person would be able to hide behind.
Gotcha.
It makes me think of that, like, you know, that sight gag you get in like old movies, you know, like person goes behind the tree, but you know, using it to split the screen and they kind of disappear behind it like that. The skinny tree, you know, like they're trying to hide behind a skinny tree, but the body's too big.
Yes.
I don't know. What city is this? They say it's an urban area.
He's in the Hudson Valley.
Okay, Hudson Valley.
Which, of course, has its own share of weirdness to it. I mean, it's a very high strangeness area, so...
Yeah, that's like one of the hot spots.
Yep.
That's, you know, I don't know why, but I keep thinking of like Fae or something like that in relation to this. I don't know if it's the gray skin or the fact that it seemed to sort of be bigger than the tree or something like that. You know, there's something very off, and you know, it doesn't fit into, you know, your normal reality that you think you would see with physics with your eyes. If that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, I think Fae is one of those paradigms that was used to explain a lot of this different stuff, even if it's not quite the same stuff.
Right.
So a lot of this stuff, when you look at it, you go, oh well. That was explained as the Fae back, you know, 100 years ago or 200 years ago or whatever.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it seems like that is in general, for me at least, though, I feel like Fae somehow connotes, or, you know, I guess Josh can scold me if I'm not actually reading this right, but I do feel like there is some connection to, like, nature or organic, and you know, maybe there is some argument for there being I don't know, a resurgence in our technological age of, you know, some sort of spirit world. I mean, there are some people that would say the spirit world is the same thing as the Fae world, in which sense, you know, we are now building some sort of like artificial spirit world. But I feel like up until, you know, this sort of recent technological boom with humanity, it really was in many ways tied to things that are organic, or something that like was existing, you know, or not even organic, but to place too. Because I think that, you know, these things that people will experience, maybe it is a human-made place that, you know, has history or something like that, but it has very much to do with location in some sense.
Right. Well, you know, to your point about that, and actually, I think one of these things that made me think about the Fae in relation to this was, you know, you'll see like in Iceland where they'll make sure to build a road around a tree or something like that because of Fae.
Yeah.
And you know, when he talked about this being a lightly wooded area but not forest, I had this idea in my head of, you know, something kind of getting trapped into that place, you know, or moved in with its territory being taken away as you know, neighborhoods and communities get closer, and so it's this, I don't know, emaciated Fae hiding out in this little island of trees.
Right. Well, it's animism, you know, in many ways, I think, you know, which I guess is, you know, sort of a generalized term for it, which probably, you know, the idea that there is a personhood to things, you know, to everything, not just us, and that, you know, that personhood manifests in a different way than sort of a human personhood or even an animal personhood, but that, you know, there's something there in that. I mean, that's also, that's similar, or I guess somebody could say I'm stretching, but I think it's similar to, the sort of the Vedic idea of the Atma, which is essentially the soul, like that everybody has. There's this, everybody has some sort of spark of the divine, and that is what gives them manifest in this reality, like that allows them to manifest in this reality. And that, I think, when you look at it, this, if you look at things from an animist sort of standpoint, and that everything has personhood, it allows, I guess, there to be more ways of that personality to manifest itself. And I think for some people, it ends up manifesting itself in, experiences like this. And that when people really are in some ways able to see or connect with the, many people, I guess these days would say the spirit of that particular place. But it really just being, I don't know, the life of that place, I guess, for lack of a better term. So I in terms of the Fae, at least for me, I always think of that as having to do with something that is, location, place, taking up space, this sort of animist personality to something.
Interesting way to look at it.
Yeah.
All right, so he continues. That's not quite it yet. He says, another possible Bigfoot experience was last summer when I was camping up in the Adirondacks. I did not see anything specific, but there were a series of strange events that put together makes me wonder if there wasn't one close to us that week. Nothing odd happened the first few days, except seeing a distinct lack of animals, especially squirrels, chipmunks, and birds, which is odd for a campground since they're usually all over the place. Although eventually they returned later in the week, the third night I woke up around 3:30 a.m. I lay there for the first few minutes trying to fall back asleep until the sound of rustling around the campsite next to us startled me. Nothing weird at first, could be a raccoon, until whatever it was started rapidly trying to open the locked door to their truck, pulling the handle very fast in quick succession, much as an impatient child would. I figured it would be that guy getting something from his trunk, but the thing is I never heard the door to the camper open before or after, which I should have since it was quite loud and squeaky. First to my mind was, oh crap, it's a bear, so I sat up and dinged my metal multi-tool to my metal water bottle since they hate metallic noises, and the noises stopped completely. I never heard anything leave or run away. Odd, but I put it off as nothing. Funnily enough, the next day I was riding down the road, which is bordered by forest on either side, when out of the corner of my eye I caught a human-like form. I said no, it couldn't be, until I realized it was a life-size plywood cutout of a Bigfoot. I learned that the employees of the NYDEC who run the campground put it there as a joke and apparently move it around every so often. Later that day, I was talking to our neighbor at the campground with his kids and mentioned it. The father laughed and said, oh, yeah, I've seen that. Funny, huh? And his 8-year-old chimed in and said, yeah, I saw it too. I seen it and it ran away from me. both myself and the father chalked it up to the kid's imagination. The next day I was out fishing in my kayak by a small point of land across the lake from my campsite. There were no campsites over there other than a single unoccupied site on the left side of this point. The other side is just forest. Before I started fishing, I had landed at this campsite to go to the bathroom since there was no one there. I finished up and went over to the side of the point in my boat where the fishing was good. I finished up and went over to the right side of the point in my boat where the fishing was good. I left a word out. I was probably about 15 feet from shore when I heard the sound of a thump of something heavy hitting the ground and then a very loud snap like a large tree branch being broken. There were no other sounds after that, and I stayed fishing there for approximately 30 minutes. Keep in mind there was not an ounce of wind that day and the lake was like glass. Again, odd, but I shrugged it off. Also, sporadically throughout the week, I would catch whiffs of a very bad smell that seemed to come and go without reason. It was like a dirty men's bathroom that hadn't been cleaned in 10 years, mixed with mold and sewage. That sounds wonderful. I thought it was some of the big rotting mushrooms there on the edge of our campsite, but after investigating, I decided they were not the cause because they barely had any smell. We were not near any of the bathrooms either. The last thing that happened while we were out there, which I did not experience, was a family member asking if I had heard a sound early in the morning on the 6th day. I had not. I was sleeping, but I asked what it sounded like, and he said, being a very avid outdoorsman and having been going to this campground for almost 60 years, said it was like no animal he has ever heard. He described it as an extremely loud howl that turned into a raspy scream. I had heard owls earlier that night before I fell asleep, but nothing like what he said, and we left the next day. One thing that was interesting to me is that there were very stern park officers going around to each campsite telling us to be careful and keep all of our food in the car because a bear had been sighted 12 miles away. In all the years I have been coming, I've never had park officers be this stern. Most years they have bear sightings and warnings, but it's usually just like mentioned when you pick up when you check in, plus a sign posted at the bathrooms and the entrance gate. So those were his experiences, and he says, as for my thoughts on Bigfoot, I think there is such a thing as a flesh and blood creature, but also after looking into Ron Moorhead's Quantum Bigfoot and hearing all the strange things that go along with sightings of these creatures, I think there's something more to them, but what it is, I don't know. It's just so hard for me to believe that they could be in such an urban area, although only about 30 minutes up the Hudson, there are large forests like the Canopus Beach Complex and Harriman State Park up by West Point, so I think it could be conceivable that they come south. I would be lying if I said these things didn't scare me. Not so much Bigfoot, but the other things in the woods, like the whole Missing 411 series, Dogmen, Skinwalkers, Wendigos, etc. But I will not let that keep me from the forest. Nature has always been like therapy to me, and while it is not fun having that fear in the back of my head, I will not let it stop me. Although I'd be lying if I said it hasn't changed some things. I will not go into the backcountry alone anymore, and if I sense something is off, I leave immediately instead of just thinking it's my imagination. I'm currently 24, and I've come to realize that these things happen to certain people, and apparently I'm one of those people. When I was 13, I was visiting Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I bought a beautiful silver arrowhead necklace. I have worn it every minute of my life since, with the exception of MRIs and other medical tests. I purchased it from a very well-known Zuni Pueblo artist and silversmith named Leonard Paquin. He told me that this arrowhead would protect me in life, and honestly, I think it has done its job well. I've had many close calls with death since then, from the first biking accident to being hit by a car while riding and flying 30 feet, to a near overdose, to being missed by a fraction of an inch by a drunk driver as a pedestrian, and the one thing I attribute to myself still being here is the necklace. Something out there is definitely looking out for me. And the last part here, he says, one night, back when I still lived in Durango, I fell asleep like I usually do holding that necklace. And what happened next was the most intense and vivid out-of-body experience I've ever had. I'm not ashamed to say that in the past I have experimented with many psychedelic substances, from mushrooms to LSD to mescaline and peyote, and I have experienced ego death before, and they have mostly been very positive experiences, but this night I was dead sober. As I fell asleep, it was like something pulled me out of this reality, not just an out-of-body experience. It felt like it was an out-of-reality universe experience. I no longer had any mortal qualities. I was not human. It was like my consciousness was stripped away from the bounds of our dimension. I was looking at time and space and everything in our universe from a fourth-dimensional perspective. There was something else there with me, too, guiding me through all this. Whether it was a higher power or being or something else, I don't know. It was like something was curating this strange tour of our reality for me. Something was pushing me along, and I want to say it was a voice talking to me, but it was more like just transferring information, and the only way I could process it was with words. But I was looking down on time and space, and from that fourth-dimensional perspective, it was a circle, and whatever was there with me made it very clear that while we experience time and existence linearly, outside of our existence, outside of what us as humans can understand, everything is circular. After this experience, years later, I came across this show called True Detective. He says the first season is some of the best television I've ever seen. There's one part where one of the detectives was talking about what he called the membrane theory, which I don't remember. Maybe one of you guys do. I would advise you to search True Detective Membrane Theory on YouTube. You can see the clip I'm talking about. When I saw this part, it literally blew my mind because it was describing the closest thing to what I saw that night, and I found it somewhat ironic that it was on a television show. I've never had an experience that vivid from any substance before or since. It literally changed my life. I just felt like I needed to tell someone about these things, as my parents and friends would never believe me even if I told them. So let's end with the true detective part. What was the membrane theory on that?
That was, if I remember correctly, it was this long dialogue section in this car scene where Matthew McConaughey's character is essentially sort of waxing poetic about existentialism and like cosmic darkness, and talks about membrane theory and how time is a flat circle. That's like the quote that comes from there. That I think is the one that this person is talking about. Time is a flat circle. But membrane theory, in terms of like quantum physics and stuff like that, or M theory, is a pretty old theory, or at least I think it came about in like the early part of the century. But it's kind of like, it's part of superstring theory, which I'm not a big fan of. My own personal feelings about it. A lot of that having to do with there hasn't been any particular, like, this is all kind of still theoretical in the physics realm. But brain theory is that it's basically that, gosh, what's a good way? I mean, I don't know, Saxon, if you have a way to describe it, I'm trying to think of a good way to describe M-brain theory.
Fortunately, I don't.
I think it has to do with this idea, essentially, that time is like that time is a loop, and that everything sort of comes from everything comes, and it's similar, I think, to sort of holographic universe, and this idea that there's like multiple universes that are sort of like overlapping each other, and that the idea of the space where they overlap is called like the M-brain. I could be completely wrong about this, but anyway, what they're talking about is, this idea of like ego death, and the idea of the universe being sort of, everything. A lot of these things are, very much, I hope that this person doesn't feel like that they're odd or strange. A lot of these things, these experiences and this ways of looking at sort of the universe and sort of the illuminations that they've had, these visionary experiences, they're very similar to, a lot of very old, ancient ways of thinking about the world, particularly thinking again about like, Vedic theory of non-duality, and this idea that, we have cycles of time that are, it's sort of this infinite loop of time that we go through, and that everything is not preordained, but that it is part of this, infinite system that we kind of basically can't comprehend. And within yogic practice, a lot of similar experiences to what this person is talking about, happened, where people experience this, oneness with the universe. I know it sounds very corny and kind of new agey, but this is something that's been happening for a very long time and really has nothing to do with new age. It's part of, mystic practice going back not just, in India, but, throughout, I think, a lot of older cultures and life ways, this idea of trying to not only kill the ego, but but feel like there's something beyond that, like, you know, the death of the ego is in fact the joining of sort of oneness with the universe. So as kind of trite and corny as it sounds, I think that if this person experienced that and they can take something positive from that allows them to feel, you know, like worth for their life, especially amongst all the hardships that it seems they've faced, that's something they should, you know, believe in and grasp onto, and, you know, let that be a driving force for them.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely an interesting experience. The Bigfoot ones as well. I mean, it sounds like there's something going on in that area. I mean, it is the Catskills, so it is a lot of wooded area.
Well, the skunk ape thing. I mean, the smell definitely is.
Yeah.
Makes me think of skunk ape.
And I wouldn't so easily dismiss the kid saying that the thing ran away. He might have seen actually something.
Yeah.
I think it's way too easy for us to dismiss kids' recollections of things and just assume they're making things up or imagining things.
I totally agree.
Well, even earlier we were talking about, you know, you have a lot more experiences, I think, when you're younger because you're open to them, and, you know, you don't count things out for like, oh, I just saw something out of the corner of my eye. I wasn't, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, this next story comes from Brian, and he says, this is a story told to me by my father when I was growing up. He never was a superstitious or religious man, but no matter how many times he told me this story, he always swore that it was true. In the late 1960s, my dad was a teenager and wanted more than a small town in southern Illinois could offer. So as soon as he was old enough, he picked up his things and moved to California. After staying there several years and not finding much success, he packed up his things and returned to home in the early 1970s. When he arrived in town, it was well past dark, and he didn't want to disturb his parents that he knew went to bed quite early. He drove to the house of Chester, a close friend of his father growing up, and found the old man sitting on his porch swing casually drinking a beer in the late hour. Chester waved my dad over, and the two sat on the porch catching up on old times, drinking, and generally having a good time. Eventually, my dad passed out on the porch, and when he woke up the next morning, he found that Chester was gone, and the front door of the house was locked. Confused, my dad went over and knocked on the door of the neighbor and asked if they knew where Chester had gone. The neighbor then informed him that Chester had passed away from a heart attack 6 months earlier. My dad was confused, and it didn't make any sense because he had been just sitting and chatting with him the previous night. The story stuck with him for many years, and he always seemed very sad when recounting it. Any thoughts on what this may be? To me, that's a story you hear, you know, especially when someone doesn't know the person has passed away.
Yep.
Yeah. You know, I've heard similar stories from my family and friends and things like that over the years. That's one of those things I would love to see how many people, you know, just to do some kind of like research on the topic to see how many people feel like they've had that experience or know somebody that does. And this is not to diminish this person's experience that their father had, but it seems like such a prevalent and powerful thing that occurs, you know, fairly often. You know, my dad passed away years and years ago, and I've had dreams about him forever. And, you know, things that seem very, very real. And so, you know, there's a place in there for that, but I do think that sometimes, you know, people find a way to get to you and talk to you if they choose to.
And if he knew he was dead, he may never have saw him on that porch. It may come down to the fact that he was able to see and communicate with him because he didn't know he wasn't supposed to be there.
Right.
That's interesting. Yeah, the idea that belief has something to do with it. Yeah, it's funny. You know, I mean, you guys, I'm sure, and many people listening, familiar with Whitley Strieber and, you know, his relationship that he has with his wife Anne. But it's pretty, you know, it's pretty interesting to hear him. You know, and you can think whatever you want about Whitley Strieber. I think I just sort of take Whitley Strieber as he comes. I think, you know, I will believe what he says until I prove it otherwise. And I think that, you know, one thing that he, at least in hearing him talk about this when you hear him do the interviews and stuff like this, is his belief is like unshakable. And I think that, you know, say what you will about that. I'm sure there's some people that would argue that, somebody is convincing themselves psychologically that they, are communicating with this person. But if the experience is real, then who's to say, who's to make a judgment? But it's really interesting to hear him talk about it, because he's so utterly convinced, and it's this like continuing relationship that he has, and such a big part of his life.
Yes.
Right. And sometimes, go ahead, Seriah. I apologize.
Oh, I was going to say, when we talk about belief too, it's not what you think you believe, but what you really believe deep down that seems to matter.
Yeah,
totally.
Sometimes I think that it can be both too, because we may consider someone to have convinced themselves of, with some type of psychological trauma, that they're still in communication with a loved one somehow. But would be the mechanics of something spiritual manifesting in reality. So why couldn't it be both at the same time too?
Yeah.
And that goes back to like, which paradigm are we looking at it through?
Yeah.
Right.
All right. So this is another short one. Okay. So this next story is from Aaron. And he says, I have two experiences I can recount. The first experience happened when I was in 8th grade. On September 3rd, 4th, and 5th of that year, I had a recurring dream of fire and a mound of bodies, the smell of burning flesh choking the air. Standing on top of the mound was a group of people. Most of them wore suits characterized by a variety of red or blue ties and were faceless. The only individual that stood out wore a robe, had a beard, and dark-complexioned skin. Some days later, the 9/11 attacks occurred. It wasn't until I saw the news depicting who claimed responsibility, and I recognized the one man who had a face when I saw bin Laden on the TV screen. I said, that's him, that was the man in my dream. People asked what I meant. I related my dream to them, and they acted like I was just making it up, partially because I couldn't identify the faceless figures standing around the one I could identify. Please keep in mind, I almost never remember my dreams. This one, however, is still fresh in my mind as if I just woke up from it. Flash forward to my 9th grade year, and I was riding the bus to school, and at that moment, something pulled my attention toward the town bank as we passed it. In the same instance, I was stricken with the thought of it would be really easy to rob it. Later during the school day, information came forward that the bank was in fact robbed barely an hour after my school bus passed it. So the first one, I mean, people having precognitive dreams about something as big as 9/11 is not unusual.
No.
But is what they said that they had, that in the dream there was bin Laden and then like a shadowy face next to figure that they couldn't identify?
They said there was a small group of people. Most of them wore suits characterized by a variety of red or blue ties and were faceless.
Yeah. And amongst them was bin Laden?
Yeah, standing in the middle.
Okay.
Or no, the only one individual that stood out wore a robe and had a beard and dark complexioned skin.
Okay. I just like the shadowy figures. I mean, that to me signals like that seems to me like some representation of the two arms of the federal government, the Democratic and Republican Party, somehow like being behind bin Laden. That's the first thing. I mean, not to go 9/11 truther on, but that's
right.
Yeah, that's the symbology that I'm reading there.
Yes, yeah, and that's kind of what I took out of it too.
Yeah.
And we have the concept that whatchamacallit puts forth in time loops, that what we're actually precognating is the information that we're seeing. Like he's actually seeing it on the news a few days later.
Yep.
That's what he's actually experiencing, rather than. And this, to me, though, this sounds like more information than what you would have gotten on the news in those days.
Indeed.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So there might have been something more to this. He may have picked up more. And what was he in 8th grade? So
yeah. Interesting.
And he says, a note to add, in 10th grade, I became interested in rituals and wet alchemy, have been a practitioner since, though in the last few years I've been on a sabbatical for most of it. So I'm not sure if that's connected, but I mean, the interest is there, obviously. Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see in my life, I had this experience where I tend to have psychic experiences on the same day every year.
Really? Huh.
Yeah. It's on my birthday. It's the weirdest thing. It's been happening since I can remember. but it was one of those things I noticed when I was younger. And him talking about September and some other things, I'd love to know some more details about him and to see if there's a recurrence here. And of course, with 9/11 being such a traumatic event, you could almost, you're talking about information and time being a loop. There might be like an information hemorrhage pushing back to him before we got there too.
Yeah,
totally. I always think of it as like ripples. The effects go forward and backward. I could be stealing that from Wargo, from Eric Wargo, but that's like the way at least I always visualize it. So if you have an event happen, especially if it's something that is a big drop that creates lots of ripples, then it's going to go backwards as well as forwards.
Well, I think I've said that too, as far as like when it comes to things like free will and stuff like that, that maybe it's like being in a lake and there are some events that create really big ripples and you're kind of drawn into that direction because those events are so big, they're not so avoidable either on a personal or a major level.
Yeah. Like a whirlpool or something like that as you get closer to it, you're just going to get drawn in.
Right. Yeah. And it's not that you have free will outside of it, but when you get close to it, it's so big that there's no avoiding it.
Yeah.
Okay. So, this is someone who had sent us a story previously, Bert, and they said, okay. So this is a 2-part story or 2-event situation. They said, after my parents divorced, I started to party more. And after high school, because it was the perfect trifecta of an excuse, being a teen, becoming an adult, teen angst, and my parents' divorce, after a few years, I noticed that I was either not doing it right or it's not my thing because I started to party harder and getting depressed. So I'd party harder to deal with my depression. I then got a job and started taking anxiety and depression medications to help me keep my job. After a couple of months, I finally started adjusting to it, but would still party to feel normal. On one of my days off, I decided to stop by my friend's house to have a jam session, a few beers, and a good time. When I got there, his girlfriend's younger brother let me in, telling me that my friend and his sister were running an errand and that they should be back any minute or so, so I stayed and waited for them. I asked if he wanted to jam with me, and he said sure, so he got on the drums and I grabbed the electric guitar. After about 20 minutes, we decided to switch instruments. I got on the drums and he got on the electric guitar. This is where and when all of my paranormal encounters start. We played for about 15 minutes and we just couldn't groove, so I started playing faster and more technical. That was always my favorite thing to do on the drums. He started to play faster to try and keep up with me, and after about 2 minutes, we just kind of looked at each other because we knew we were just about to mesh and come up with something good. And that is when we heard one of the most terrifying things we've ever heard. When we both started playing, after we warmed up, a disembodied guttural growl or scream, like a typical metal band might do, was heard out of nowhere and filled the room. At the same time we started playing it, it was as if this voice was watching us, or I don't know, or maybe it wanted to join in with us. This disembodied guttural scream was just as loud or louder than what we were doing, and even weirder that he has this worded very strangely. Even weirder is that I did notice when we started playing faster after I got on the drums that we were both annoyed that we couldn't groove, but I could see how annoyed, like, I think he means how annoyed his friend was like him, but we kept going. And after hearing the disembodied guttural scream, that came off the same energy we were feeling when we started to get annoyed. So basically the scream felt the same way that they were feeling when they couldn't quite mesh with one another. So he says, almost like it got us in a trance and chimed in at the perfect time. After about 7 seconds of the growl and us playing blast beats and fast riffs, we snapped out of it. I dropped the drumsticks and he took off the guitar and we both ran out of the house. On the way out, we didn't even look at each other. We just ran out and he said he was going to his friends and I said, okay, I'm going home. We both knew that we were both petrified, but we both powered through barely and we went our own ways that evening. I was so disturbed I decided to leave my truck there and walk home. I would do that sometimes when I would drink or hung out a little longer than what I thought I would to have a walkabout on the way home or just clear my head. I don't know if this thing latched onto me or what, or maybe I was just so scared that I overcompensated, but probably looked weird. But on the way home, just about everybody that would see me would get startled and would just distance themselves from me. That added to what I had just heard at my friend's house. As I was about a block away from my house, a couple of people around my age, 20 back then, got in the truck and they were tailgating and hanging out. That really messed with me because they were crazy, tough, good old boys. They were actually a little too much for me, but I was still friends with them. That was pretty much the end of the whole ordeal that day. I got home and just tried my best to calm myself down, but the more I tried to negate it and say it was just one of the amps that malfunctioned, the worse I would feel. I was on edge for weeks, and of course my medication would just numb me out to that. About 6 months later, a friend of mine suggested that we drive out to San Marcos, Texas. I should have mentioned that I'm from Houston, Deer Park, Pasadena area. I was still taking medication, so I didn't drink on the way up there because I was really trying to slow down the partying bit. The 3-hour drive was really helpful. I didn't feel like my old self again, but the trip did help until we got to San Marcos. The first night, I felt about the same, still more or less after a couple of beers. That was about the time I started to struggle with reality, if you will. I told my friends about what had happened, and I felt like they thought I was either making it up or hallucinating, or they didn't pay attention and acted like they did. All that day I was struggling with anxiety, but I didn't know what anxiety was, so all I could do was drink a little and smoke to take some of the edge off. At night, around 12:30, I asked my friend if I could borrow his bicycle to go out for a ride around the town. After about 30 minutes of riding, I decided to go up this hill to see the town lit up. There were houses on the way up the hill, and not one person was out that night, and it was kind of weird because it was the weekend. When I got up to the top, I thought I had come up on some coyotes in the lawn of the house at the top of the hill. I had never seen them in person, but I knew what they looked like. They did creep me out because they stared at me, but for some reason I needed to rub my eyes, and after I did that, the coyotes turned into deer. I know this sounds ridiculous, but that's what I saw. The coyote turned into the butt end of the deer, and I saw that because what should have been the tail of the coyote before they turned into the deer then turned around and stared at me just the same. Who knows, maybe my eyes did play a trick on me, but I was startled because I thought they were coyotes. I kept going a little more to the end of the street, and I got off the bike and put the kickstand down to park it. I walked over to the edge of the hill to take in the view. Half a minute goes by, and I hear the deepest guttural growl I have ever heard. I say this because I had actually forgotten about the disembodied voice 6 months ago. I immediately pictured a lion and thought that one would pounce on me, but whatever it was never moved out from the shadows in the bushes. It came from one direction about 5 or 6 feet away from me on the side of the hill in front of me. After hearing that, I instinctively put my hands up, showing it that I meant no harm and I didn't mean to disturb whatever was on the side of the hill. I did not see what it was because it was dark, and it was behind one of the bushes on the hill. Because it happened so fast, I stepped forward again because I had just seen the coyotes. No, hang on. Because it happened so fast, I stepped forward again because I had just seen the coyotes turn into deer, so I thought this was an auditory hallucination. After one step forward, it growled again, even deeper and louder. I then said, okay, out loud, and kept my hands up and started backing slowly until I got the bike and got on, not taking my view away from where the growl came from. I got on and rode away at a normal speed at first until not turning my sight away from the original area until I could not see it anymore, and then pedaled as fast as I could back to my friend's house. When I got there, he asked me if I was okay because I looked pale. I immediately asked him if there were any bobcats in or around San Marcos, and he laughed and said no, and then asked why. I told him about what happened, about what I heard and saw, and he says, oh, well, probably was a bobcat. I didn't think so because these growls I heard were meant for me and were very deep, much deeper than what a bobcat's growl would be. In fact, it was deeper than a lion's. Maybe a tiger could growl that low, but still, this was no lion or tiger loose in a small Texas town. I had been to a zoo in Houston and Chicago, so I knew the only thing that could make it sound that deep would be an animal bigger than a bobcat. It could have maybe been a mountain lion, but still the growl was too deep and too controlled. I felt it go through me, making me feel like a feather. I'm about 5'9", and at the time I was about 240, and I felt absolutely powerless with those growls, and I also felt like it was wanting me to leave and nothing else. Who knows, maybe I was in the way of those deer over by the house. I have one more paranormal supernatural cryptid. I don't know what it was, but I only heard of what I saw once on the Strange But True Stories. Or maybe it was Beyond Creepy, but it was about the Scissor Man. To me, it looked like a compass that I used on maps. That's all he says about that one. So this kind of puts me in mind of the first story we went through.
Mm-hmm.
Being up in the hill, yeah.
Is he saying that? Was he saying 6 months took place between hearing this original sound when he's playing music with his friend and then hearing it again? It's the same one? Okay, yep. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I've had, like music definitely can stir stuff up. Yeah, I don't know though, like it coming back after that time. I mean, it sounds like, I always, if somebody's going through, a difficult time, particularly psychologically, I always feel like that makes them more susceptible. I mean, susceptible or in touch with, in whatever way you want to think about it, but more susceptible to having experiences like this. So,
and also creating poltergeist effects.
Yeah, exactly. It also sounds pretty cool. I mean, like I can't tell if he's saying that it was good, that it was helpful when he was playing the music with his friend, that the voice helped them, or whether or not it scared them.
Well, from what I'm getting, it's a little weirdly written through there, but it sounds like they couldn't quite gel. But at the point where they suddenly started gelling, like this growl came in right when it should have, as if someone was singing.
Yeah.
And they continued for, a few seconds before they were almost like they were in trance.
Okay.
And then they just kind of stopped and were like, oh my God, what's that? Let's go,
Yeah. Okay, I got it. Yeah, I didn't know if it was something it sounded to me like they might have continued playing or that it was like something that worked for them. Interesting.
No, it seems like it kicked in right as they started to get in gelling with one another.
Yeah.
Like I said, that part's written a little weird. What was that?
Oh, I said how incredibly metal. Like, I just love that.
Yeah, that's why I was hoping it was like a good thing, because I was like, it's brutal, right? Like they're like, that's what every metal band wants to do is, you want to summon a demon with your music. Come on.
Well, not to make light of it, but you can. I think you're talking about music kind of stirring things up, and I think you can pull ideas down on you too, and things like that, or entities or spirits, whatever that. They may have found something passing by that was like, "Oh, I'll help you out."
Yeah.
But maybe not something that's malevolent, bad, or malign, but not necessarily something that's benign either. It's sort of that wild animal type of character where it's dangerous if you do the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And maybe that's where some of the growls and some of those other experiences come in when he was seeing the coyotes and the deer and something like that, where you've got to respect the boundaries of whatever that is that's hanging around you. And that may have been what, caused some of those people to react differently to it.
And with the anxiety and such that he had, he might have been, it very literally could have been poltergeist energy he was literally giving off that was feeding this stuff. I mean, first the growl, then the people acting weird toward him because he may have been giving off really weird energy, and they didn't necessarily know what it was, but they're just kind of like, oh,
Right.
And the same with this, because he was having, a lot of anxiety, and he, rode the bike up to the hill to kind of get away from things, but it may have still had an outlet if he's prone to that type of thing, especially being younger.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that the altered state of consciousness, between, and I'm not saying, this is not an anti-drug thing, but just like if you have a lot of stuff that's in your system in terms of medication or that are altering your consciousness on top of emotions, you're just that's a storm waiting for something to manifest with such pressure, like it's a pressure cooker on your consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more here. This one's a short one. This comes from Joakim, Joakim. Joakim, would that be right?
Joakim, yeah.
All right. I apologize if I got that name wrong. So they said, this happened to me when I was a teenager. I'm now 40. My father had an old flame who had given us a pair of stereo speakers, and they were in use in my room. One of them on a low platform right next to my pillow, only a few inches higher than my bed. She later died choking on food in her own bathroom with my dad out by the dinner table waiting for her to come back out. One night, months after her death, I woke up with the speaker standing on my head and leaning against the platform. I don't know if I woke up as it was being stood in my head or if it had been there for a while. I opened my eyes immediately upon waking and saw the door to the hallway open as I had left it when I went to bed. So it's possible that my dad or sister pranked me, but none of them have ever been pranksters. Also, if I woke up as soon as it was placed on my head, then it's impossible that either of them had done it. Then they said also, this is more of a funny story. My mom's now husband had a house right next to hers. It's how they met. That gave most people the creeps. Wood painted dark brown, dark rooms, musky wallpaper, and several people claimed bad energy there. I was asleep alone in the house one night, was halfway up the stairs and I was to sleep alone in the house one night. That's what the sentence is. Was halfway up the stairs and heard a voice speaking in German from the very bedroom I was about to sleep in. I turned back down the stairs and went into the other house in a jiffy. Come daytime, I find out that the transistor radio that was left there last time someone slept there had simply been switched from FM to AM instead of from on to off. And the last part of this said, and then there was a night when me and my sister were around 13 and 15 and playing with a homemade Ouija board with two friends in our kitchen. After a while, a thick candle holder made of solid glass and roughly the same size and shape as your fist flew off the table and broke in two on the floor. Had that thing been dropped on the floor from the ceiling, we would never have expected it to break. That's how solid it was. But it was in two pieces from a mere fall from the table to the floor. That's when the evening ended, and we never did that again.
That's a familiar experience for all of us, I bet.
Yeah. It's so funny how the Ouija board has become such a big thing. It's funny. It was actually a little bit of history that locally around here in Baltimore is that it was actually invented. The guy that came up with it did it. He was living above a 7-Eleven, and it's still like a landmark. Like this is where the Ouija board was invented. This game designer was living above what is now a 7-Eleven.
Okay, what is now a 7-Eleven? Okay.
Yes, it wasn't a 7-Eleven back then. You're right. Yeah, that's
okay.
That would be pretty weird.
Yeah, because that was 1800s.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, when was it? That was I think it was more like the 20s, if I remember correctly.
Really?
Like that. Well, this is this particular Ouija board design that we're all familiar with, which is the guy's name was William Fuld, F-U-L-D, William Fuld, and I think it was in the 20s. Here, I'm going to go look at this right now. But now it's a 7-Eleven, and you can go and visit it here in Baltimore. They have a plaque that sits there. I think there were boards like this before then, but it's now there are boards that existed, but this is like the classic design that we now know of, that whatever Parker Brothers picked up or whomever.
Right.
I wish you could get a 7-Eleven Parker Brothers Ouija board from there or something.
Yeah, right. That would be great.
Yeah.
I know I should do a short little doc on the place. It's funny.
Oh, that would be great. That'd be fun, Chris. The music, the German music out of the room, that I call that note music.
Well, it's just speaking. It was just speaking.
Speaking German, excuse me.
Yeah.
Pardon. Especially conversations. The music is one of those things you can kind of pace. But if I heard the conversation for sure, I would have been like, I'm not staying in that room.
But the fact that it was just a transistor radio is kind of like that's sort of like enhanced, I think, by the setting of the place being creepy.
Yeah.
Right.
And then someone accidentally leaving not turning off the transistor radio and accidentally putting it on AM, which is more likely to get something weird than FM is.
It's just the whole aesthetic coming together to create that atmosphere. Yeah. Oh.
And the speaker leaning against their head, I mean, that's odd.
Yeah, that's so funny. I love that. I have no idea what that means, but that's pretty great. Like a speaker balanced on their head.
I hope that if the people that we love or knew are able to interact with us, they have some fun with us now and then. So, I hope it's something like that.
And that's a good way of putting it. It doesn't mean they have to lose their sense of humor just because they're not, corporeal anymore.
Exactly.
I don't know. There's ways of looking at it where you can say, well, you're sort of creating this stuff, like okay, so it was a poltergeist that that you created that moved the speaker, but there's no way to know which way this stuff goes. I mean, we know poltergeists are a thing. We know, that PK energy is real, but that doesn't discount all the stories of people like the guy talking to the guy on his porch, who's been dead for 6 months. That's not poltergeist activity.
Right. Exactly. And that's fascinating to me because, those stories like the one where the dad was visiting Chester are almost like folklore, because stories like that are told in many places. And that just goes back to the importance of acknowledging that those experiences are happening too, because they obviously happen. People can go back to something very specific and say, this happened to me on this day, anyway.
And like I said about all of this stuff is that this stuff happens. We may not be able to explain it. We may not know exactly what it is, but it's ridiculous to say it doesn't happen because it's been happening to every culture throughout history, throughout written history, and probably much longer. So to say it doesn't exist is kind of a silly statement. It obviously exists. What it is a different question.
Right.
Yeah, I think that I always go back, and I probably say this every time I'm on the show, but I always go back to this thing that Jerome Clark said. It was that he talks about how there's like experience phenomena and then there's like empirical phenomena. Like, you can, if you have a crash flying saucer, you can, pick that apart as, like physical or material phenomena. There's material, there's stuff. Same thing with Bigfoot. Sometimes you have, substance that's over, and that can be dealt with in a materialistic scientific fashion using the scientific method. But then there are these other types of phenomena that are experiential phenomena that really there's nothing material that exists for it, but yet for the people that were part of it, and either individual people or people together, it's it is just as real as if there was something physical that remained. And that, at least for him as a researcher of the Fortean, like he always felt like he wanted to make sure that he gave equal credence to the validity of both type of experience or both type of phenomena.
Yeah. And that's a very good way of putting it.
It really is.
As whatchamacallit, Kripal said, this stuff happens for a reason.
Yeah.
All right. So if you have a story you'd like to submit, stories at wheredidtheroadgo.com. I have a few more we didn't get to tonight, but not quite enough for another show. So if something's happened to you and you want to talk about it, get a hold of me. Again, stories at wheredidtheroadgo.com. That is the best place to send them. Also, there are a few people I said I was going to get in contact with and have on the show to tell their stories that I have not followed up yet because I completely forgot until I was looking for stories tonight. So I apologize, and I will be getting a hold of you. All right. So, Chris, where can people find you?
You can find me at brightrectangle.com. You can look for our films on Amazon Prime, and that's it.
And your films are what?
You can look for The Corpse, which is a experimental feature adaptation of Robert Chambers' The King in Yellow, kind of like a psychedelic freak-out art house film. And then there's The Hill in the Hole, which will right now is for rent on Vimeo, will soon be on Amazon Prime, and that is a kind of kooky midnight movie horror film starring Adam Gorightly.
And both are available for free if you're a Patreon.
Indeed.
You can scroll back a little bit to when these guys were on for that show, and you will find links to watch both movies right now. Yep. Also, it's interesting because is it The Corpse or is it Corpse?
Just Corpse.
Okay. which is based on The King in Yellow, and so is True Detective that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's funny. Like we had just started shooting the film when that came out, and it's dealt with in a very different way. Like they're using it in a cool way, like it being this, this is sort of expanding the mythos. Yeah, but it was funny when that came out. That was an interesting synchronicity.
All right, and Saxon, thank you so much for joining us and for all your support.
Hey, thank you for having me on, and glad to do it.
I'd like to take a moment to thank all of my Patreons. You're the ones who make this show possible. An extra special shout out to those of you pledging $10 or more. Allison Cook, Lindsay Trebet, Super Inframan, Tim, David Moore, Vincent Trewell, The Great Change, Stone Wilderness, Luke Osborne, Rob Drummond, Alex Whitcomb, Damian Tallman, Edu Camahort, Tactical Therapist, Janet Bunderson, 36 Dingo, Maria, Sam Sheeran, Jennifer Campbell, American Rambler, Kevin, John Rutledge Foster, Eric Citron, Andy McNamara, Matthias Sumby, Dominic O'Malley, Christopher Vaughn, Riker and Stark, Sean Cosgrove, Jose A., Roger Gonzalez, Craig Cicernos, Ray Benedetto, Linz Jackson K., Alfred Tuttle, Matthew Sproul, Kevin Schreck, Patricia Giaquinta, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, Chris 646, Carla Mahoney, and James Lattimore. Thank you all so very much. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.